Welcome to episode 25 of Mental Mastery. We interview the world's greatest minds on what it takes to live an epic life. I'm your host, Max Weigand, and today I'm excited to talk to Dr. Happy himself, Dr. Tim Sharp from Australia. Tim is a world-leading expert in the fields of positive psychology and mental health, a sought-after speaker and executive coach, as well as a best-selling author and chief happiness officer of Australia's first happiness institute. So Tim, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So excited to have you here today. And so, most important things first, how do you manage to get the title Dr. Happy?
Well, it's a funny story, actually. Firstly, I didn't give it to myself.
I
It was given to me by a friend, a colleague, a guy that I used to do a lot of work with. And I suppose if I go back in time, my background's actually in clinical psychology. So the first half of my career was, I guess, in a more traditional area of psychology where I was offering therapy to people who were stressed, depressed, anxious, etc., all of those usual things. And then probably around 15 or a bit more than 15 years ago, the very early stages of positive psychology started. And I was fascinated with it and really loved the idea and started shifting my focus and the focus of my practice and my work from traditional clinical psychology to positive psychology, and started to focus more on thriving and flourishing and happiness. And around that time, this friend of mine, Andrew, who I was doing some work with, didn't really give it a lot of thought, but he signed off an email once just saying, "See you, Dr. Happy." And and long story short is, it kind of stuck.
Well, that's a great thing. I mean, Dr. Happy is definitely a great name to have, especially in this field. So really love that.
Yeah, well, it is and it isn't. But to be honest, I was a bit reluctant at first because I had a good reputation. I was well established, and I thought in the early days, I thought people wouldn't take me seriously. But then at the same time, I learned fairly quickly that it got people's attention. People did love the idea of it. And it was a great conversation starter, and it still is today. So it's a great conversation starter. And just as importantly, it starts good conversations, not just about what happiness is, but also what it isn't.
Oh, for sure, for sure. It's funny, because just last week I was talking to Dr. Timothy Pitchell from Carleton University in Canada, and he's often referred to as Dr. Procrastination, right? So I got Dr. Procrastination, now Dr. Happy, which is really exciting. But you made an important point here about this idea that oftentimes we don't really know what happiness is exactly, what it isn't. So I know happiness is very hard to find term, right? It's sort of different for every person. But how do you define happiness for yourself?
Yeah, look, you've raised a couple of important points there. And look, yeah, it is and it isn't hard to define. It certainly, there's no doubt, as you said just a minute ago, that it's different for every person. So that's one of the first things I'd say, that each and every one of us, each and every one of the listeners, needs to really think about what it means for them as an individual, and that won't be exactly the same as the next person. So my definition won't be exactly the same as yours or anyone else out there. That being said, there are some common elements. So we know from the research that there are some common themes amongst what does make most people happy. There are some cultural differences, but as a general rule, there are two simple ways we can think about happiness. One, the simplest way is it's a form of positive emotion. So one of the things that I try to get into every day is some joy, some pleasure, a bit of fun, and that's important. But we also know that happiness in that sense is fairly short-lived. It's fleeting. It comes and goes. It might be while you're having a laugh with a friend, or while you're enjoying a treat, or watching something funny on TV, or whatever it might be. And that's fantastic. It's really important. But as I said, it probably won't last long. So the other way, which is just as important or more important, to think about happiness is as meaning and purpose, or living our best possible lives. And that's not always about fun. It's not always about laughing or smiling. It is about that, but it's about working towards something really meaningful, which might be difficult. It might be challenging. It might involve, blood, sweat, and tears. It's also about other people and building good quality connections and relationships. So that second form, as I said, it isn't as smiley. It's not as laughy. It's not as bright and positive, but it's just as important and probably more meaningful in a way. So what we need to do is try and find a balance between having fun in the moment and enjoying life, but also working towards something that's really satisfying and provides something longer lasting throughout the course of our lives.
Yeah, that's such an important point you're raising here about sort of finding a balance, right, between those quick fixes, right, or immediate gratification that can feel good in a moment, right, but it's not fulfilling in the long run, and then those longer term things like positive relationships and meaning and purpose. And one of the other videos I heard you talk about, which was really fascinating, how introverts and extroverts actually may seek different types of positive emotions.
Hmm.
Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit, on the sort of individual difference what you can find there?
Yeah, definitely. So, look, as I said just a minute ago, it's different for everyone. You know, we're all different people. We've got different backgrounds and different beliefs, different cultural beliefs, maybe different religious beliefs, different personalities. You know, like other aspects of life, happiness will be different for different people. But one of the ways we know that it can differ is based on some of those strong personality traits like introversion and extroversion. And, you know, we can all think, or if you think about ourselves, but also think about our friends or colleagues, it's not hard to it's not hard to see that some people are more attracted to or are more prone towards seeking those high arousal forms of positive emotion, like parties and social engagements and getting out there and really living loud, I suppose. Other people might be more prone towards and more interested in pursuing quieter pursuits. With fewer people reading at home. And they're the sort of more introverted person. Now, they're not mutually exclusive, and most of us like a bit of both. I guess it's just a balance where extroverts will tip a bit more towards those high arousal, social, positive moments. Introverts will tip a bit more towards the quieter moments. But the reality is most of us will sort of fit somewhere in the middle, and that's one of the tricks, I suppose, is trying to get that balance right.
Yeah, for sure. Trying to get the balance right, and also figuring out for yourself, like, what is it actually that really fulfills me, makes me happy on a daily basis, right?
Mm.
One of the personal struggles that I had for a long time in my life, I had this belief that I had to be happy, like happy 100% of the time, like 100%, right? Just be happy all the time, and I was trying to do that. I had the expectancy, right? Um, but of course, that's not quite realistic, right? So what do you tell people usually that are kind of sort of question like, oh, should we be happy all the time? Should we try to be happy all the time? What's your sort of take on that?
Yeah. Oh, look. Very simply, the answer is no. It's not possible. It's not realistic. So anyone that's trying to be happy all the time will just set themselves up for failure, and they'll just be disappointed. It's totally normal and appropriate to experience what psychologists would call the negative emotions. So
Yeah.
sadness is normal, anxiety is normal, frustration, anger, grief. These are all normal human emotions, and this is a big part of the message that I say to people is yes, happiness is a wonderful thing. It's great in lots of ways. It will add to your life and help you achieve other things. And yes, we want to try and be happy as much as possible, but no one will be happy all of the time. And what we also need to do is accept and acknowledge those unpleasant emotions because they're vitally important, just as much so.
Oh, for sure, for sure. So this quote from the Dalai Lama. He once said, "Happiness is the ultimate purpose of life." So would you agree with that? Do you think we should all prioritize happiness to a higher degree in our lives?
Well, yes, and yes, mostly yes. But I do think it comes back to what we talked about just a couple of minutes ago, which is our definition of happiness. So, as long as we define happiness in the right way or in a helpful way, then yes, I think that's vitally important. I guess the risk is if people just focus again on pleasure,
Yeah.
then the risk is they'll live a hedonistic or selfish lifestyle, and that's not necessarily great. And I'm sure that's not what the Dalai Lama meant. We don't want to be selfish. We don't want to be
Mm.
hedonistic. That's not necessarily in the best interest of anyone. But if we're thinking about happiness as an appropriate amount of pleasure plus not just feeling good but also doing good. So altruism is part of happiness. Helping others, listening to others, being compassionate and caring to other people. Working towards meaningful goals. If we think about it in that broader and deeper and more meaningful sense, then yes, I definitely would encourage people to prioritize it.
Yeah, you touch upon something really interesting here also, is which is this idea that happiness is not just like a feel good thing, right? But it also has this incredible effect on all other areas of our lives, right? Where it helps us make better decisions. It helps us interact with people in a different way. So can you share a little bit more maybe about the sort of interaction between happiness and success, or happiness and just making good decisions in our lives?
Yeah, look, that's a particular something I'm particularly passionate about, and I wrote a couple of research papers about that a couple of years ago, I suppose. And it's similar to, I mean, some other people have written on it in similar ways, but the idea that many people are brought up with, many of us, I guess, are taught at school or through our through our culture, I guess. Much of Western culture teaches us that if we're successful, we will then be happy. So
Yeah.
we're taught to set goals and work hard towards those goals and strive, and and then when we get there, everything will be great. Now that's true to some extent because it does feel good to achieve. It does feel good to succeed, and it does feel good to to accomplish something that you set out for. So that's not totally, it's not a crazy idea. However, at the same time, we know that it's just as important to put happiness first, and the theory at the heart of the papers that I wrote a couple of years ago was what I called the primacy of positivity. And what that suggests is that if we put happiness first and foremost, that will actually increase your chances of success in life. Because we know that happiness, and again, if I'm talking about that broader definition of happiness, not just selfishness, but if we define it properly and find the right balance between all those various factors, that's actually energizing. It's motivating. We're more likely to strive and work hard and persist beyond pressure and overcome challenges. And so, happiness can lead to success just as much, if not more so, as success leading to happiness.
Yeah, I find that such a fascinating concept that just by, like you said, the primacy of positivity, right? But putting our happiness first and first making sure that we're in this positive state, that ironically then like everything we do is better because of it, right? Like it's sort of like everything you do turns to gold, right? Sort of thing where every interaction, every behavior is just more positive because of that. I'm really curious though, do you have any favorite measurements of happiness or ways to really evaluate that? Like I've been really looking into PERMA model lately. Do you have any favorite ways or any favorite models to really sort of measure and report your happiness?
Oh, well, there are lots, as you probably know.
Yeah.
One of the things a lot of people don't understand about psychologists is that they love to measure things. So there are
Yeah.
lots and lots of measures. And I guess the question, or the answer to the question is, it really depends what you're trying to do, or what research you're doing, or what project you're working on, because they're not necessarily one measure is not necessarily better or worse than the other one. They're just slightly, that is, different focus, say. So, some measures of happiness focus purely on the positive emotions. Some are focused more on what we might call quality of life, which is a much broader measure. Some focus on the contributing factors like optimism or resilience, or the quality of our relationships. So I guess my answer is no. I don't necessarily have a favorite one, but what I would do is if or when I'm working on a particular project, is to weigh up the pros and cons. They all have advantages and disadvantages, and find not necessarily the best one, but the one that's most appropriate for that particular purpose.
Oh, that's definitely a good point you're making here about just sort of finding the right thing for the right purpose. I also love the point you made here about psychologists measuring stuff, right? Because initially when I started, my bachelor's degree in psychology, I wanted to go in this field because I thought I would never have to take a math class in my life again, right? And I started and I was like, shoot, there's stats all the time, right? Because we tend to like measure things so well. Do you think that's part of the reason why positive psychology has been really sort of on the upflow over the last really 2 decades or so? Because finally, for the first time in human history, we can actually measure the positive effects of meditation, the positive effects of gratitude, all of these interventions that have been around for thousands of years, but like before that were kind of, I guess, not as not looked upon as scientifically valid, but now we can finally measure it. Is that sort of why it's sort of in the coming? Do you think that's why?
Oh, yeah, I think that's a big part of it, definitely. There's no doubt that. Well, look, as you said, you made a really good point. A lot of the principles of positive psychology, a lot of the core concepts, as you quite rightly point out, have been around for a long time. So, one of the big issues, one of the big themes within positive psychology is mindfulness. Another one is optimism. A big part of positive psychology is quality relationships, etc. So these are not new issues. These have been
Yeah.
around for, if not decades, then hundreds of thousands of years. Um, so people have been talking about them, writing about them, thinking about them for forever almost.
Yeah.
You're right. One of the things that I guess one of the big things that positive psychology has done is bring a scientific rigor to that. And that's not to say that we've invented it or it's new, but what we can now say is this works because science says it works, not just because some smart or charismatic person says it works. And that's an important
Yeah.
difference because that means we can replicate it. There have been all sorts of charismatic philosophers or religious leaders or motivational speakers for many, many years who have said, similar things, and that's fine, I suppose. But we could never really be confident that, that if it worked, it wasn't just because of the power of their persuasion. But now we do know that, that the research behind positive psychology is very well established now, and it's becoming stronger and stronger. More and more support in these areas, and as I said, the fact that science supports it is important because it means we can then apply it to more and more areas and be confident that it will, that it will have a positive effect.
Oh, for sure. It's so important. I think that, like, really, like you said, the scientific rigor, right, that you bring to this discipline to the point where it's really more of a scientific discipline, right, than rather than just this feel good thing, whatever. Um, I've heard you talk before about creating a happiness plan for your life. So do you have any tips? And I really thought it was a fascinating concept, right? Because I've been sort of doing that in my own life, but in like a coaching context, I never thought about actually creating like a happiness plan for someone. So can you maybe share a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, it sort of goes back to the idea that or the point you made, maybe 5 minutes ago or so, about prioritizing happiness, and this is really interesting because if I've spent the last several decades talking to people
Yeah.
about happiness in different ways, and it's really quite interesting. If I speak to all sorts of different audiences at big companies here in Australia or around Southeast Asia and big conferences, and no matter where I am or who I'm talking to, I pretty much get the same response, and that is, if I ask an audience to put up their hands if they're interested in happiness and they're interested in having more happiness. So even if you're happy now, how many of you would like to be happier? 99.9% of people put up their hands. Almost everyone
Yeah.
says yes. And that's, of course, why wouldn't we? Even if I'm happy now, why wouldn't I want more? But what I then often do is follow that up with a second question, which is, okay, how many of you have a happiness plan? Depending on the audience, it varies a bit, but usually I'll only get something like maybe 10% or 15%,
Wow. Yeah.
which is quite shocking, really. It's quite sad. So what these people are saying, and again, it's all different people in all different contexts, so it's pretty consistent. But what they're saying is, I want to be happy, but I'm not planning for it. Now, we know from other areas of life that if you want to achieve something, you need to plan for it. So if you want to create wealth, you need to have a financial plan, a savings plan, an investment plan. If you want to get fit and healthy, you need to have a diet, which is an eating plan, and an exercise plan. So we know it works in other areas, and people do it in other areas. But for some strange reason, or a variety of strange reasons, people aren't doing it in this area. They've never thought about it, or they don't know how to go about it. And really, the point is, all I'm trying to say is that if you want something to happen, you have to plan for it. It's not going to just happen automatically or magically. It's not going to just magically fall into your lap or somehow knock on your door and walk in your front door. You've got to create it. You've got to make it happen. And having a plan is just a way of making that easier. Setting out, daily goals, weekly goals, prioritizing, working out what you really want to focus on. And what's important about that is that also helps you not just work out what to do, but what not to do. And this is one of the really interesting areas of happiness that I think people often neglect. There's a lot of focus on what to do. We know that exercise is good for happiness. We know that optimistic thinking is good for happiness. We know that spending time with good friends is good for happiness. But what's just as important is what not to do. And that's something I invite people to think about as well. What do you want to stop doing? What do you need to avoid? What could you say no to that might make your life better?
Yeah, that is so powerful. I think like really think about how or like what you need to do on a daily or weekly basis, right? And actually to feel this happiness on a really consistent basis. So I love that. Um, and really, one thing I wanted to touch upon is this idea that you can actually train your happiness muscles, right? Like you can actually
Mm.
do things on a daily basis that like in the long run make you happier, right? Um, and it's really like what I found is that it's always the basics, right? Like creating like a happiness plan as you call it, right? Or like doing things that interventions that make you happier. They're not these like incredibly complicated things. Like oftentimes, like you mentioned, it really comes down to basic things like exercise or
Mm.
sleep or the right nutrition, right? Or just, meeting friends, right? Like it's oftentimes these simple things that I think we tend to overlook in our pursuit of happiness, right?
Oh, very much so. I think a lot of people I speak to, or a lot of people that come to me, are kind of looking for something maybe magical or mystical,
Yeah, that
or
magic pill.
and it's not. It's as it, look. I totally agree, 100%. It's pretty basic. It's pretty simple. Um, I hope this translates into German or whatever. In English, we have a saying there's something as common sense, but what we know about common sense is that it isn't always common practice. Um,
Yeah.
so a lot of people, a lot of the people that I speak to, and as I said, that can be hundreds or possibly thousands of people each week, depending on what I'm doing. A lot of them will come up to me, or a lot of them will say, "Well, look, yeah, I kind of know that." I say, "Great, but are you doing it?" And
Yeah, right.
there's a big difference, and this is what I sometimes call the knowing doing gap. We often know what we should do, but we don't do it. And you're 100% right when it comes to happiness. It's not mystical. It's not magical. I'm pretty sure everyone out there listening will probably know, if not all of the things, then most of the things they need to do. As you said, setting and working towards meaningful goals, looking after our physical health and well-being with good diet, good exercise, good sleep, um, thinking helpful, positive, constructive thoughts, building positive relationships with others, practicing gratitude, mindfulness practice. These aren't new things; they've been around for a while. But if you take the average person and say, well, look, are you actually doing them every day or every week? A lot of people say no, and that's so the challenge isn't necessarily teaching people what to do. They often know that. It's more about finding what do they need to do to make it happen on a regular basis, or what's getting in the way of that, and how can we remove those obstacles.
That's such an important point here. I think that like really you have to help people not like actually apply those things, right? All the things that we know. There's this great quote. I think it was from by Derek Severs, right? He said, um, "If more knowledge was the answer, we'd all be billionaires with perfect apps," right?
Yeah.
Um, and I love that because it just shows that like we all kind of know what we should be doing in our lives, right? Like by now, I think you have to live, in the middle of nowhere under a rock, right? In order to not hear about, hey, you should exercise regularly, right? You should get enough sleep. You should eat the right diet. Like everyone kind of knows these things, but like what sets people apart is like, do you actually do it on a daily basis? Which is what you mentioned before, right? So I really love that point. So what do you find are some of the biggest obstacles that are holding people back from actually, prioritizing happiness and actually doing those things on a daily basis?
Yeah, well, look, it's a great question, and it really differs for different people. But a couple of the common ones that come up. I mean, I think many of us get distracted by that shiny new thing.
Oh
By
yeah.
So I go back to exercise, as you said, because that's a nice tangible example. And as I said, I doubt that there's anyone out there that doesn't know that exercising on a regular basis would be good for them. But why do so few people do it? Well, there are all sorts of things that might seem more attractive than going to the gym in the morning, especially if it's a cold, rainy day. So, and there are all sorts of things that might seem more attractive than practicing meditation or getting to sleep early. So, it's things like, well, scrolling through social media, watching Netflix, uh,
Yeah.
believing in the advertising and marketing world, for example. So look, that's I don't like to blame them because I think, to be honest, I think capitalism is probably the best financial system we have.
Yeah.
But one of the problems, I suppose, or the side effects of capitalism is advertising and marketing. And again, I don't want to blame that because it's not all bad. But what we need to understand is that certainly here in Australia, and I'm sure I'm sure for all of your listeners wherever they are, but each and every day we're bombarded by hundreds, if not thousands, of messages
Oh
um,
yeah.
on billboards, on the trains these days, on our smartphones, on our computers, through Facebook and Instagram. And what what a lot of these messages are telling us are, you'll be happy if you buy this thing.
Yeah.
So you'll be happy if you get this new gadget. You'll be happy if you wear this particular brand of clothes. You'll be happy if you drink this particular type of drink. Now, if most of us, if we stop and think rationally, we'll know. Most of us will know that it's crap, but
Yeah.
we still get sucked into it, and so we spend our money, we spend our time, we devote our attention, our resources to things. They might not be totally bad, but they're not really going to bring us lasting happiness, and most of us know that. However, we still get sucked into it. So to go back to your question, one of the biggest obstacles, one of the biggest challenges is being disciplined enough not to get sucked into that, not to fall into that trap, and to understand that, look, there's nothing wrong with buying stuff if you like it, but what we need to understand is it won't really bring lasting happiness. If you really want lasting happiness, you're much better off taking those, whether it's dollars or more importantly, probably time, your attention, and devoting that time and attention to a good friend, to a loved one, to your husband or wife or boyfriend or girlfriend or kids or whatever it might be. That will give you a much greater return on investment than buying anything.
Love that point that you're making it totally, and I think you referred to it before as the tyranny of when, right?
Mm.
So this idea that we're always chasing sort of the next thing and always chasing like this future happiness in things or people or circumstances, when in reality, like we could have it right now, right?
Yeah, and that's that's another bit. I think I briefly touched earlier on the idea of gratitude and appreciation. I mean, I think a lot of people, and look, not everyone, and I know there's no doubt that some people out there listening will have problems in their life. We all have problems, and for some people, those will be bigger than others. There'll be challenges and adversity, and I don't want to discount that or diminish that. But the reality is that for a lot of people listening, a lot of us are actually happier or could be happier than we realize. Not and that doesn't mean, not by buying or adding anything in, just by focusing on what we already have. And this is what, this is one of the things we definitely find when we look at the happiest people, and we, going back to the point we made earlier, when we measure certain aspects of their life, the happiest people, without a doubt, spend more of their time focusing more on what they have and thinking less about what they don't have. So that practice of appreciation and gratitude it's a relatively simple thing. In fact, it's a very simple thing, but we need to practice it daily and regularly. We know that with just a couple of minutes a day, a few minutes a day of practicing gratitude can significantly boost your happiness, and it doesn't cost you anything. It doesn't require the purchase of any goods at all. It's really just about thinking about what's good in your life rather than worrying so much about what's missing.
Yeah, such a powerful tool. And you already touched upon adversity and trauma and problems in our lives, right? And I think especially during those times, gratitude is powerful. But what else can people do if they're really struggling right now, if they're going through some adversity, if they're struggling with their lives or certain areas of their lives? What do you like advise people to do if happiness is such a far-flung concept for them in this moment? What can they do to sort of start getting into that feeling again of just feeling good on a daily basis?
Yeah, another great question, because you're right. There's no doubt, and this, going back to my previous life in a sense as a clinical psychologist, most of a lot of the people that I saw in my early career were so unhappy, were so miserable, were so stuck that happiness, as he said, it was almost like a foreign concept that they couldn't even imagine. So,
Yeah,
um, so we need to go. Those we need to start where they're at, and there's a couple of ways I'll answer that. Firstly, if someone out there listening today is significantly distressed to the point that they're struggling to get out of bed or get to work or get to school or studies or whatever it might be, if they're struggling to eat and look after themselves, if they're really significantly depressed or highly anxious, or then I suppose what I'd say is to seek professional help.
for
The
sure.
the good news is that the help is available. So we've got some very good treatments available now for the most common forms of mental ill health. So particularly, the two most common forms of psychological illness are depression and anxiety. And the good news again is that if you see the right person, get the right treatment, that there is help. Help is available. People can actually overcome, particularly depression, anxiety, and some of the other, a lot of the other forms as well. So that's the thing. But I suppose unfortunately, often when people are so down, they feel so helpless, they feel so hopeless, they feel so isolated, that they feel like it'll be like this forever. And I guess what I want to say is it doesn't have to be like this forever. You can get better, you can get over it. So yeah, seek. I guess it depends a bit on where you are, and every country has different health systems. But go to your local general practitioner or primary healthcare physician or a good clinical psychologist, and find help that's available. For people who are maybe not that severe, I suppose, or who don't who are just feeling a bit down, then it's the same sorts of things that would help, I guess. And just start bit by bit. Remember, happiness won't necessarily come overnight, but just take whatever small steps you can. And I guess again, it goes back to that idea of discipline, or refer back to the idea of physical fitness, because again, that's a tangible thing that we can all relate to. But it's very similar, So what I would say is, if you're sort of at the moment not very healthy, you're not very fit, you're kind of spending a lot of time sitting around. Maybe you work at a desk and you come home and spend a lot of time watching TV. But you recognize you want to feel fitter and healthier. Maybe you want to run a marathon or run a 10-kilometer race. Well, you wouldn't go out and run that tomorrow if you've done
Yeah.
nothing. But what you might be able to do is, just start by walking around the block or jogging around the local park, maybe just a kilometer or, a couple of kilometers. And then, this is pretty common sense again, just slowly building up from there. Each day or each week or each month, just run a bit further, you run a bit faster. And gradually over 3 months or 6 months, you might be able to get up to that 5 kilometers or 10 kilometers. Well, happiness is the same. Just start off with whatever you think you can do out of the things we've spoken about, or maybe I can send some resources. You can link to some resources at the end of this. Yeah, and so just start off with a bit of gratitude practice. Start off with setting some meaningful goals. Keep it really simple, but build from there. And what we know is that little things add up. From little things, big things grow. And as you start to have a bit of success and achieve some things, you'll feel a bit better, and then you can gradually do more and more. So that's the approach that I'd recommend to most things in this area. And again, I encourage people to don't underestimate what you can achieve. It might take a while, but that's okay. Maybe it'll take a couple of months or a couple of years, but as long as you're heading in the right direction, you'll get there, or you can enjoy the journey along the way anyway.
Yeah, so many good points you're making here, and I really want to highlight first of all the point you made about seeking professional help. Right, if you're really struggling, I think that's the most important thing, that you actually get that professional help, right, and not try to sort of go at your own, and really reaching out to people. I think is very powerful in that sense. And then also what you just mentioned about it taking time, right? I think that's important to realize. That like it's not gonna be a quick fix, right? It's not gonna be the thing that pill you swallow and like everything's gonna be perfect, right? Like it takes a while for the habits, those mental habits, the emotional habits, to really manifest and really become part of your life, right? And I think that's sort of important to really set the expectation. I think especially in the beginning when you're trying to become happier, right? Is that like it's gonna take a while, and it's gonna take also effort, right? Like we already touched it before upon this idea you mentioned, that oftentimes like the things that give us the greatest amount of joy and happiness and purpose in our lives, they're not necessarily easy to do, right? Like you said, like going to a gym or going for a run, or sitting down and meditating, like those things are sort of the exact opposite of this immediate gratification that as a society nowadays, I think we're constantly chasing, right? Like we always want sort of the quick fix and the feeling good, right, in the moment, but we're not as willing to do the things that are sort of good for us in the long run. So I think that's an important point you're making about it's not always fun and it's not always easy, but over the long run, it's going to lead to the greatest amount of joy and love and happiness that you can experience in your life, right?
Very much so. And yeah, so just to pick up again on a couple of points there, yeah, it's a really important point that it's not always easy. It's not always fun, and some of the things that do lead to happiness and health and well-being, the fact is they require hard work. That's that's just life. But it's worth it. And the
Yeah.
other thing to keep in mind is happiness isn't. It's not necessarily something you ever. It's not a destination. It's not something you get to. Even if you're doing all of these things, and even if you are enjoying a good life, you need to constantly work at it. Just like physical fitness, Again, I do exercise regularly, so that's something that's a big part of my life, and it's something that's really important, not just for my physical health, but also my psychological health. So I go to the gym most days, and I work out most days, and I am, I'm reasonably fit and healthy. But if I stopped that tomorrow, I wouldn't stay fit and healthy.
Yeah.
Fairly quickly, if I stopped going to the gym tomorrow and just didn't go anymore, relatively quickly, within a matter of weeks, certainly over months, I would lose a lot of that strength and fitness. And it's the same with happiness. You can't just sort of get there and then stop. You've got to keep going.
Yeah.
It needs to become a part of your daily life. And even then, even if you're doing everything fantastically, as we said earlier, it doesn't mean you'll be happy all the time. I know we touched on this, but it's important to reiterate it that even if you're doing all the right things, even if you're working hard and really disciplined, uh, we will all have days when we feel down. We will all have days when we feel sad or we get frustrated. That's just life. Things happen. Bad people do bad things, or stuff goes wrong. Technology breaks, whatever it might be. So, a couple of really important points there. You've got to work hard at it. You've got to keep working hard because you'll never get there. It'll never be perfect. And even if you're doing all the right things, sadness and grief and anxiety will still pop up every now and then just because that's what they do.
Yeah, that's definitely a lesson that I had to learn very painfully in my own life. I think, growing up, I was like 17, 18, started getting into like professional athletics, right, in track and field. And I had this end goal, right, which was like going, getting into the national team in Germany, right? And like for
Mm.
years, I had this weird thing where I was like, I thought to myself that if I achieve that goal, then I'll be happy, right? And I'll live in this like moment of just bliss for the rest of my life, right? And it was funny because I achieved the goal and then it felt amazing, right? But it felt amazing for like a week. And then I
Yeah.
was like sort of back to normal, right? And I thought that was like so fascinating, how quickly we can adapt to those like end states and end goals. And that's when I really learned that what you said here is really the journey of every single day. So of seeking happiness rather than looking for it in, a year from now or 10 years from now in outside circumstances. So really love that point.
It just reminded me of I had a very similar experience early in my career when my dream was and my goal was to become an academic, which I achieved. But I remember when I was working hard and I eventually completed my PhD, my doctoral thesis, and that I'd been working full time, so I was doing my PhD on top of that. So it was fair. It was
Wow.
quite
Okay.
hard work. It was a really busy and quite difficult, although fulfilling few years. But yeah, I remember exactly the thing, handing in my PhD and then getting the marks back that was all passed, thinking, wow, this is fantastic. And
Yeah.
then almost immediately, almost within days, just thinking, oh, is that all there is? Is it,
Right.
with the world still going, life goes on. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't work towards those goals. As I said earlier, they're still important. It's still good to have those things, but we need to understand, well, as both in your case and both those examples that we've given, that it's not all about success and accomplishment and achievement. That's just one part. It's a good part, but there's other parts as well that that can set a really broader, more solid foundation for a really good life.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Now, Tim, on the show, we always love to celebrate failures. So, do you have a favorite failure in life? Any failure, any drastic problem that actually set you up for later success, later skill sets, later mindsets in your life?
Oh, I've got lots of failures. Okay.
Great, great. Got a good one to choose from.
Yeah, well, and look, and all it goes half joking there. All jokes aside, I mean, this is a funny topic. It's a topic I'm very passionate about, actually, because the reality is everyone has. Like
Yeah.
who hasn't failed, and yet, it's something we're still often afraid to talk about, which we shouldn't be. I think if as you said, well, I think the best people in life, the most successful people I've met in life, have probably failed the biggest. And they're often not afraid to talk about it because we learn from our failures, we learn from mistakes. So, look, I could tell you, I mean, there have been several. I've made several mistakes in building my businesses. I've made many mistakes in my attempts to help other people. But I'll tell you one which is, I don't know if it's not necessarily a failure in a sense. Well, it kind of is and it isn't, but it is something that I think is relevant. And that's that we've talked about my focus on happiness in my career and
Mhm.
my nickname of Dr. Happy. But the reality is that I've actually experienced depression for most of my adult life. So I've suffered quite intense and severe depressive episodes on and off over quite a few years now. So extreme to the extent that early in my life, I tried to end my life, to be perfectly honest.
Oh my
Um,
God.
and I don't, sorry, didn't mean
Mhm.
didn't mean to
No,
shock
no,
you,
no,
but
no, no. But thank you for being so vulnerable and so open.
Well, I'd say that because and again, I don't necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily call it a quote unquote failure, but it's similar in a sense. And the reason I do talk about it now is that I think it's really important we talk about this aspect of our life because at the time, one of the hardest things for me at the time, and this is when it first happened many years ago, was that I felt so alone. I felt I was the only one, and going back at that time, particularly, there was a very large stigma associated with mental health. So we were, people are often embarrassed and feel shameful about experiencing depression or anxiety, and that stopped me getting help. It stopped me overcoming it. And what I've realised in recent years, and I'm cutting a long story short here, is that I don't need to be embarrassed about it. I don't feel ashamed about it. It's something that happened for a variety of reasons, and it's part of who I am for a variety of reasons. And as much as it's still very difficult and challenging at times, and I don't like it, in a strange kind of way, I do think it's been a big part of my success because the flip side of my or part of my depression is I'm a very sensitive person. I feel a lot. I'm very empathic, and so that means something goes wrong, I feel it in a really deep and sometimes, unfortunately, a very dark way. But that's also led to me, without sounding immodest, I think that's why I've been a very good psychologist. It's why I've been able to help other people because I care a lot. I'm very compassionate. So I guess what I've come to learn is that my worst bits are also my best bits. My darkest qualities are also my brightest lights. And then I don't necessarily, it's not that I love it. I try to come to terms with it, but it's just part of who I am. And I think that's what we need to do with failures is see them as, there's a good side to every failure. There's a lesson to be learned. There's growth that can come from getting things wrong. And that, if we can take these difficulties and challenges and turn them into wisdom or growth or maturity or strength, well, then in a sense, in the long term, they're not failures at all.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate that, and you're making so many powerful and important points here. First of all, really, I think that everyone can struggle with this, right? And something that like isn't talked about enough, right? I think especially the stigma around mental health and stuff, people just aren't willing to open up enough about it and to talk about it and raise their hand, being like, "Hey, I'm struggling with this too," right? Um, I think just both in mental health and also in general life, it's so important to really be able to sort of own this, right, and acknowledge like, "Hey, yeah, this is something that I used to struggle with, or maybe that's something I'm struggling with right now," right? Because I think one of the characteristics of resilient people, right, from research is that they're willing to open up, not just bottle everything up inside of them, right, but they're actually willing to share that. And like you mentioned, like this is, I think, in a weird sense, it's a great gift for you, right? Because it actually allows you to really connect deeper with people that are struggling maybe with the same things, right? Because you can relate and you can share your own experiences. So that's really powerful. Um, just this week actually, there's this great event. It's I think started about 10 years ago called Fuck Up Nights. I think it started in Mexico. A couple of friends were getting drunk, right, and it started like sharing their biggest failures, their biggest fuck ups in their lives, right. And what they found was that just sharing their biggest problems and the darkest like insecurities actually like sort of release those, right, and actually made them feel better. And so now all over the world there's this events called Fuck Up Nights where people just go on stage and they talk about the biggest mistakes, their biggest failures in their lives, right. And I thought it was such a great way to really start getting into this mindset that like it's okay to talk about failures and it's okay to fuck up things, right. And that's just part of life. But we always try to put on this facade, right, of trying to be perfect and trying to, be happy and all the time, and never really acknowledge that there is a dark side to life, right? There is problems and there is, there are struggles. And so thank you very much for sharing this and opening up here and really, making this point that it's so important to really talk about those things.
Oh, thank you. And yeah, look, I do think it's important, and it's quite liberating to be honest, because if you're trying to keep all these things secret, that can be it's painful. It's hard work, and it might not be as I guess the example I gave is a sort of relatively dramatic one. It might be just something really small, but I think people will often find that if they can just being honest, particularly with with their close friends and close family, being honest it actually allows for much better quality and deeper quality connections and relationships. It's a big part. You're probably familiar with Brene Brown's work around
Yeah. Mm.
vulnerability and authenticity. Yeah, so that's increasingly becoming popular now. That just living an honest life, being open and honest, is so much better for everyone involved. It's hard sometimes, but the benefits far outweigh the difficulties.
For sure, for sure. Now, Tim, do you have a favorite mantra or quote that you live your life by?
Oh, I've had lots over the years, and I guess I tend to it sort of changes depending on the stage of life I'm at, or depending on what I'm particularly working on at the moment. So I tend to there's a number of ones that I sort of rotate through. But I suppose if I had to choose one, it would probably be something like that achieving happiness requires nothing more than practicing a few simple disciplines each and every day. And I
Love
like
that.
that
Yeah.
one. It just reminds me that, as we've said earlier, it's because even I get sucked in sometimes. Think, God, what's the magic answer? What's the big answer? And look, there isn't one. It's just about doing the right things on a regular basis, being consistent, persevering, plugging away. There isn't some sort of magic wand or magic bullet, or and it's important to remember that. So. Whatever the other, but yeah, I mean, there are lots of great quotes out there, and I love a lot of them. But I suppose I keep coming back to that one because again, it just reminds me that I know what to do. I've just got to keep doing it. There'll be good and bad times, but if I keep doing the right sorts of things, then it'll pay off eventually.
For sure. Love that one. Now, Tim, before I ask my final question, where can listeners connect with you online? What's your favorite social media platforms, website, whatever it is?
Yeah. Oh, great. Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity. They can, if they go to my website, which is www.drhappy, so drhappy.com.au, that will lead them to my social platforms. But if you're on Instagram, you can find me at it's actually the Happiness Institute, or one word, Happiness Institute, or on Twitter, which is Dr. Happy, Drhappy.
Awesome. Perfect. I'm also going to link to those resources. Now, final question. What does mental mastery mean to you?
It's probably, to me, it probably means I guess a summary of pretty much everything we've spoken about. Practicing the disciplines so you can master your mental state to achieve what you want to achieve. And I guess today we focused a lot on happiness, but mental mastery can be if you master the strategies and the components that we've spoken about, then not just happiness but success and well-being and so many other things will be more available. So for me, mental mastery means mastering those aspects of yourself, of your psychology, that you need to do to achieve what you want to achieve.